In 2009, 11 girls boarded a yellow school bus on a bright October afternoon. They never came back. No wreckage, no survivors, not even a tire tread. For 15 years, the world moved on. But I didn't. Because one of those girls was my daughter. And all I ever needed was one small thing, one forgotten detail that the rest of the world missed. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, down in the comments. And if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life, tap that like and subscribe. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Sarah Darrow. I was 48 that year, and I've lived in Maple Hollow, Missouri my whole life. The kind of town with white porch swings, unlocked doors, and one high school. If you blinked driving through, you'd miss it, but I never planned to leave. I worked part-time at the library and spent the rest of my time making sure my daughter Leah had everything she needed to make her last year count. Leah was 17. Soft-spoken, but the kind of presence that made people stop and listen. She was captain of the Northwood High cheer squad, and that fall they'd qualified for nationals down in Dallas. First time in school history. It felt bigger than this town usually allows. The week before they left, the gym was buzzing. You could hear music bouncing off the walls every afternoon, sneakers squeaking, girls laughing that sharp call of 5, 6, 7, 8. It was joyful, familiar, safe. Leah had worked for months to get the routine just right. I remember watching her that Wednesday right before they left, holding the clipboard and checking off names like she was already running a team in college. I packed her a little care bag, ginger chews for the road travel size Advil, and her lucky ribbon from when I was a cheerleader myself back in '79. Ayanna Reed was the youngest on the team, barely 5 feet tall, full of muscle and grit. Her grandfather always said she could take a punch better than any Marine. And then there was Romy West, forever filming with that little camcorder of hers, saying she'd be a director one day. That Thursday afternoon, the parking lot was full of waving parents and car horns. I remember the sound of it all, high-pitched and happy. You could feel the pride in the air. Still under all the noise, I remember a strange kind of stillness, just something quiet in my chest I couldn't name. Leah hugged me tight, maybe tighter than usual. I brushed a curl behind her ear and told her to call me as soon as they got to the hotel. She smiled, said, "We're gonna win," and jogged toward the others. I stood there and watched her climb on that bus with 11 girls in red and white jackets, each one waving like they had the whole world ahead of them. And then it was quiet. I went home and put on a pot of coffee. Around 10 that night, I checked my phone. Nothing. Not even a quick, "We made it." I tried calling once, straight to voicemail. I told myself it was probably just spotty service or a dead battery, but by midnight that feeling in my chest, that stillness, it wasn't still anymore. It was tight. Wrong. By 2 a.m. I was pacing the living room with the porch light still on, and by sunrise, the phone finally rang. But it wasn't Leah. And that was the moment everything began to fall apart. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to one of the assistant principals from Northwood High. He sounded calm, almost too calm, as he explained that the cheer squad hadn't yet checked in at the hotel in Dallas. I sat down hard on the edge of the couch, gripping the phone tighter, listening for something, any hint in his voice that this was just a scheduling mix-up, some kind of delay with the driver a wrong turn. He mentioned that the school had reached out to the event coordinators at the Nationals venue, and they confirmed the team hadn't arrived. No one had seen or heard from the bus since it pulled away from the high school nearly 12 hours earlier. I remember saying, "That doesn't make sense." And it didn't. It still doesn't. The assistant principal tried to reassure me, said they were probably just late, maybe the GPS had dropped signal, or the driver forgot to check in. I clung to that for a few minutes, but it didn't last long. I hung up and called Leah's number again, straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times. Nothing. Then I called the parents I knew, Ayana's grandfather, Romy's dad, the Ellises, the Goldsteins. It was the same story for everyone. No texts, no updates, no answer from the driver. Some of the parents had already begun calling the school hours earlier. One had even called the police, but they hadn't taken it seriously yet. Just a late bus. By the time the sun was up, things had shifted. A kind of collective dread settled across Maple Hollow. It moved through the town like a fog. The school sent out a mass call acknowledging the team hadn't arrived. Local police started making calls to state patrol. The dispatcher for the district's transportation office was trying to ping the bus's GPS, but it hadn't updated since just after crossing into Oklahoma. No emergency alerts, no crash reports. Just silence. I paced the front porch with my sweater pulled tight, waiting for anyone to pull up and tell me there'd been a mistake, that Leah was fine and the girls were fine and the driver had just taken the wrong exit and lost his charger. But that didn't happen. Around 10 that morning, one of the other moms, Beth Laramie, knocked on my door. She looked like she hadn't slept. I invited her in and we sat in my kitchen watching the news. By then, the local stations were running the story Missing Cheer Squad from Northwood High. 11 girls, 1 driver. Last seen the previous afternoon. I don't think either of us spoke for a while. We just listened to the same details being repeated in different voices. Missing, unreachable, unexplained. Somewhere after noon, the FBI got involved. That's when the cameras showed up. Vans parked outside the school. Reporters walked the sidewalks outside the gym. The whole country, it seemed, had turned toward our little town. They found the driver later that day, Kalen Rohr. He was at home sitting on his recliner watching the news like the rest of us. Claimed he dropped the girls at an interstate rest stop outside McAllister, Oklahoma, so they could stretch and grab snacks. Said he went across the road to get coffee, and when he came back, the bus was gone. Not stolen. Just gone. His story didn't make sense. It didn't track. But he didn't panic, didn't call anyone, didn't even report it. He just said he assumed someone else had picked them up, maybe a backup driver. Like that was a normal thing to happen. They tested him, of course. Blood work, polygraph, background check, nothing came up. No criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. But I didn't care about his record. I just kept thinking about Leah's last text. Weird vibe today. I'll text you when we get there. That was it. That was the last thing I got from her. 2 days after the bus disappeared, a gas station camera near Muskogee turned up a piece of footage. It showed the yellow school bus driving past the pumps around 7 in the evening. It didn't stop. No one got out. The headlights didn't even blink. Kalen was visible in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, staring forward. Nothing looked wrong. But that was the worst part, how normal it looked. Just a bus in motion moving down the road like it had somewhere to be. No struggle, no flashing lights, just forward. That image played over and over on the news. Parents started gathering at the school. Some just stood in the parking lot for hours staring at the place where the bus had been parked. Others huddled in the gym with school staff and detectives. There was nothing to say. No one knew what had happened. I sat with Ayana's grandfather most of the second night. He held a photo of her folded into his palm. Romy's dad kept pacing the back of the gym, waiting for an update that never came. At some point, someone brought in trays of sandwiches and coffee, but hardly anyone touched them. We weren't hungry. We were just waiting. By the 4th day, tips started pouring in. A waitress in Waco said she saw a group of teenage girls wearing matching jackets. A trucker said he spotted a white van near a rest stop with girls in the back, maybe the same girls. A psychic from Boulder swore they were underground near water. Most of it led nowhere. No footage, no confirmation. Every clue evaporated within hours. The bus company released a statement. They'd run background checks on all their drivers. Kalen had been with them for 8 years. No complaints, no flags. The dispatcher said she tracked the GPS all the way into Oklahoma, then the signal just dropped, right outside the range of one of the cell towers along Route 60, and then nothing. A week in national reporters began calling them the Vanished 11. Pictures of the girls in uniform ran on every screen, smiling faces, matching bows, posed pyramids, all frozen in time. The town built a makeshift memorial at the edge of the football field. 11 candles, 11 names. I didn't go at first. I couldn't. The idea of seeing Leah's name written out like she was already gone, I wasn't ready for that. I just sat at my kitchen table and stared at the wall. My phone rang non-stop. Family, friends, reporters. Some of them said things like, "She's strong, she's smart, she'll be okay." I didn't respond to any of it. After 6 months, the FBI held one last press conference. They said they had exhausted every available lead. The case would remain open, but it was being moved to inactive status unless new evidence came forward. That was their word for it. Inactive. Like the girls were just misplaced files waiting to be found. I remember standing in Leah's room that night, touching her backpack still hanging on the closet knob. The zipper was halfway open. There was a receipt inside from a smoothie shop near the school. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket without knowing why. After that, life in Maple Hollow went quiet. The town moved like it was sleepwalking. Teachers went back to grading. Neighbors returned to weekend yard work. But nothing felt the same. People stopped locking eyes, stopped asking how you were. A silence settled over the whole place, but not for me. I didn't stop watching. I didn't stop listening. Because somewhere in all that stillness I could feel it. There was still something missing, something small, something no one else had noticed yet, and I had no idea it would be sitting in a dusty box above my attic steps, waiting. I tried every possible way to get someone to look again. I called the sheriff's office twice a week for almost a year, asking if any new tips had come in, if maybe the signal from the GPS had been misread, if someone had checked the rest stops with fresh eyes. They were polite at first, then they weren't. One deputy told me flat out that I needed to let the professionals handle it and try to move on, said it with the kind of tone that lets you know the file's already been moved to the back of a drawer. I drove to the FBI field office in St. Louis and stood at the front desk with a folder of printed news stories, Leah's school photo, and a map I'd drawn with every location the bus could have passed. They listened, said they appreciated my dedication. Nothing came of it. I wrote letters, hundreds, to senators, to journalists, to the Department of Transportation. Once, I even tried reaching out to one of those morning talk shows, thinking maybe if someone big enough paid attention, it would force the investigation back open. Most never wrote back. The ones who did sent generic condolences and said they were sorry for my loss. Loss, as if it had already been decided. The town got quiet about it after that first year. The gym still had the memorial up, and every fall there was a candlelight vigil, but people didn't talk about the girls anymore, not really. It became one of those things you're supposed to carry silently, like bad weather or old injuries. A few of the families moved away. Romy's dad left for Ohio. Ayana's grandfather passed in his sleep heart failure, they said, but I think it broke the day he stopped hearing her voice. Some folks tried to keep the search alive for a while. There was a Facebook group and a couple of petitions, and one man started printing flyers again, but it all faded like everything else does in small towns that get caught in something too big for them. The school started rebuilding. They hired a new bus coordinator, new cheer squad, same colors, same mascot, but it wasn't the same. It never would be. I remember one conversation clear as day. It was at the grocery store maybe 2 years in. I ran into a woman I knew from PTA meetings. She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to smile or not, then finally said, "Sarah, you're so strong. I don't know how you do it." I told her I wasn't strong. I was just still here. That's all. She nodded like she understood. But then she said, At some point, don't you think it's time to accept that maybe they're gone? I didn't say anything back. I just paid for my coffee and left. That was the last time I went to that store. People meant well, I think. Or at least they didn't mean harm. But that line, except they're gone, that's what they always came back to. That was the polite version of let it go. I couldn't. I didn't know how. Leah's room stayed exactly the way she left it. I never boxed anything up. Her backpack still hung from the closet knob. Her shoes were lined up under the window bench. One pair of red and white cheer sneakers still had bits of field grass stuck to the soles. I dusted, but I didn't rearrange. I didn't dare touch anything that felt like her. At night, I'd sit in there sometimes, lights off, just listening. There wasn't any sound, of course. But I listened anyway. Maybe for memory. Maybe for something else. Most days I walked to town. Even when people started crossing the street when they saw me coming, I still walked, pinned up new flyers, sat on the library steps with my folder, waited. People started calling me that poor woman. Then they started calling me Crazy Sarah. After a while, they stopped calling me anything at all. But that never mattered to me. What mattered was the thing I couldn't shake, that no one really looked hard enough. That something had been missed. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I had to keep looking. Some days it was a blur. Others felt sharp in a way that hurt. Like when I found a disposable camera in a kitchen drawer and realized it still had pictures from that last week. Or when I opened a book in Leah's room and found a note she'd left herself about packing granola bars. I kept everything, every small, unremarkable piece, not because I thought it would solve anything, but because it was proof she had been here. And then came the storm. I don't remember the date, just that the sky went that strange greenish color, and the wind picked up fast. The power flickered and finally went out around mid-afternoon. I lit candles and sat near the attic stairs trying to clear space for buckets in case the roof started leaking. That's when I saw it, a box pushed far back behind the insulation panels. No label. Just dust. I pulled it toward me and opened the flaps. Inside were old VHS tapes. Dozens of them. Home videos, school events, family birthdays. I hadn't touched these since the year everything stopped. I should have put the box away. I should have left it in the dark where it had been for so long. But I didn't. I brought it downstairs and dug out an old TV with a built-in VCR. It took a few tries to get it working. When I finally got the picture steady, the screen came to life with grainy footage of a school gym music playing, girls in formation voices shouting counts. And then Leah, center mat, leading, laughing. I felt my whole body still. I watched the tape all the way through cheer practice, packing scenes, girls loading the bus. I'd seen this before, but not in years. Not since before my mind had split everything into before and after. I leaned forward, pressed pause, then rewind, then play again. And that's when I saw it. Something I hadn't noticed. Something that didn't belong. In the far corner of the lot, barely in frame, was a dark SUV. Maybe black, maybe navy, it was hard to tell with the static. A man stood outside it, leaning against the driver's side. The camera wasn't steady, but I watched closely. Kalen, the bus driver, stepped into frame. He looked at the man, and then quick as a breath he nodded. Just once, not a wave, not casual, a nod with weight to it. Then he looked at his watch. It didn't feel like habit. It felt like timing. I rewound again, watched the same moment, and again. The more I watched, the clearer it became. Kalen hadn't just been waiting for the girls to load. He'd been waiting for a signal. From that man, that car. I wrote down the timestamp. Then I opened my laptop and went digging. The school had moved most of its footage archives to a public portal a few years back. I found the official parking lot angle from that day, same scene, same timestamp. But the SUV wasn't there. It had been removed, edited out. I watched both tapes side by side, heart-pounding, palms damp. It had been right in front of us, all those years, and not a single investigator had caught it. But now I had something real, something no one could ignore. I picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office. I gave them the timestamp, explained the difference between the tapes, tried to keep my voice steady. The deputy on the other end barely let me finish before he cut me off. Said I wasn't the first person to think they'd cracked the case from their living room. Said they'd heard it all, psychics, conspiracy theorists, even someone who thought aliens were involved. I tried to explain again. He told me they had procedures. I hung up. And then I opened my browser and typed 5 words into the search bar: Unresolved Disappearances Forum Cheerleaders SUV. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I didn't expect anything from the forum. Honestly, I thought I'd post the clip, maybe get a few strangers telling me I was seeing things, or worse, offering prayers. But that night, I clipped the time-stamped portion from the VHS and uploaded it to a thread titled Northwood Cheerleaders Possible Edited Footage. I didn't give the whole backstory, just the basics. 1 clip from a personal camcorder, 1 clip from the school's official archive. Same moment, same bus, same background. Except one had a dark SUV, the other didn't. I laid it out plainly and went to bed thinking nothing would come of it. By morning, there were over 200 comments. Most were what you'd expect people asking for clarification, debating the model of the vehicle, questioning the video quality. But a handful stood out. One person username, buried River78, said they recognized the SUV right away. Thought it looked like an early 2000s Chevy Suburban dark navy extended model, no plates visible. Another claimed they worked maintenance at Northwood back in 2009 and remembered seeing that SUV parked near the staff lot on and off for weeks. Said they'd mentioned it to the vice principal once, but nothing came of it. And then, a few threads down, someone else chimed in, former FBI analyst verified through the forum mods. They said the SUV's presence had never been mentioned in any publicly released reports. That alone was worth looking into. They flagged the post for further review and said they'd be passing it along through a few back channels. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but it was the first time in 15 years anyone outside Maple Hollow had taken me seriously. 2 days later, I got a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Detective Ronald Cates with the state's Bureau of Investigation. He'd seen the footage through a colleague and wanted to ask a few questions. His tone was different. Measured, yes, but not dismissive. He asked where the original tape had been stored, how I knew the dates lined up, and whether I had other copies. I told him everything I could remember, where I'd found it, the attic box, the old camcorder, the timestamp I'd written down. He asked if I'd be willing to meet in person. I said yes before he finished the question. We met at the local precinct 3 days later. It was strange walking into that building again. The last time I'd been there, I was clutching Leah's photo and begging someone to put out a broader bulletin. This time, I walked in with a flash drive and a printout of the forum thread. Detective Cates wasn't what I expected. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Quiet voice. No tie. Just a windbreaker and a small notebook he kept flipping open without looking down. He didn't offer me empty reassurance. He asked real questions. We watched the clip together in a back office. The lights dimmed and the sound turned low. When the nod came, Kaylin turning toward the man at the SUV, Cates leaned forward, rewound, watched it again. "That's not casual," he said. "That's communication." He didn't say much else after that, but I could see it working in him. That shift. The kind of stillness that meant gears were moving somewhere deeper. He took the flash drive, made a copy of the VHS, and asked if I'd be open to further contact. I told him I'd waited 15 years. I wasn't going anywhere. Things moved quietly after that. I wasn't kept in the loop, not officially, but I knew something had shifted. About a week later, another user from the forum messaged me privately. said they'd seen chatter that the footage had reached the regional division of the FBI. I didn't know whether to believe it, but 2 days after that, a woman from the Bureau called me directly. Said her name was Agent Denise Hayward, and that based on new visual analysis, they were re-examining several pieces of evidence from the 2009 disappearance. The next time I heard from Detective Cates, it was early evening, and the sky was just starting to turn. He told me they'd done a digital enhancement of the clip. The SUV's make and model were confirmed, and a partial VIN had been extracted from a prior DMV record matching the vehicle's silhouette. It belonged to a company, technically a shell corporation registered in Oklahoma. Paper trail was shallow. No real office, just a P.O. box and a disconnected phone number. But the name attached to the incorporation documents had come up before tied to a now-defunct transportation group that years back claimed to provide rehabilitative relocation services for troubled teens, places that promised structure stability and a second chance. Most were cash-based, privately contracted, barely regulated. Some had been investigated before. A few shut down. Most slipped through cracks big enough to lose entire lives in. Detective Cates asked if I remembered anyone from that era, any staff faculty outside names that ever mentioned alternative youth programs or off-campus referrals. I didn't, but something about the phrasing stayed with me. Relocation services, like moving inventory. Like this was a system, not a moment. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Leah's room and reread every article I'd saved. Looked over every name I'd circled over the years. Nothing jumped out, but the feeling that something vast had brushed past us, that we'd all been looking in the wrong direction, grew harder to ignore. About a week later, the detectives got a warrant. Quiet, unannounced, no press. The property in Arkansas wasn't listed under the company's name directly. It had been sold and resold through at least 3 layers of shell entities, but the location matched a dead zone in the GPS logs from the day the girls vanished. No signal out, no signal in, just a black dot where nothing was supposed to be. It was an old farmhouse, long abandoned, half swallowed by trees. They said when they got there the front porch had collapsed and the inside looked ransacked by time weather damage, animal droppings, peeling paint, no electricity. But beneath the warped floorboards in what had once been the dining room, they found a metal latch. And under that, a set of stairs leading down. It took 3 hours and 2 sets of hydraulic tools to get the door open. What they found beneath it wasn't a basement. It was something else. A bunker. Cinder block walls. Steel reinforcement. Rows of rusted bed frames. Chains bolted to concrete. Piles of clothing shoved into plastic bins. Red and white, Northwood colors. The air down there hadn't moved in years. There were no windows, just one narrow vent. And on the far wall, names, scratched in. 11 of them, some full, some initials, some interrupted mid-letter like someone had been pulled away before they finished. The forensic team cataloged everything, took samples, marked the walls. One of them, a younger officer, later told Cates they stopped talking halfway through. Just worked in silence. There was nothing to say. But there was one more thing they found wedged beneath the frame of the last bed. A notebook. Spiral-bound pages warped from moisture. The handwriting uneven. A child's hand or someone who hadn't slept. The cover was blank, but on the inside, they told us we were going home. Don't believe them. And then further down the page, stay awake. Don't drink the milk. I saw Leah cry. I don't want to forget her face. That was the moment I broke. Not because it was her name, not because it confirmed what I feared, but because someone in that darkness had tried to hold on to her, tried to remember her, even when the rest of the world had forgotten. They didn't call it a rescue. Not yet. Not then. But in the silence that followed, I knew something had shifted for good. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It was starting to surface. And whatever came next, I would be ready to face it. They called me in again about a week after they found the bunker. This time it wasn't at the local precinct, it was a state building, one of those tall concrete ones with quiet elevators and hallways that feel too wide. Agent Hayward met me outside the conference room and offered me a coffee I didn't touch. She said they were still going through the evidence and couldn't share everything yet, but there were developments. One of the first things they'd done was revisit the original bus logs from 2009. There wasn't much, just a printed itinerary, departure time, driver's name, expected route. But the GPS logs, the ones pulled from cell tower pings and satellite tracking, those had gaps back then. Not enough towers. Limited data. Now, though, with new triangulation software, they were able to overlay the signal patterns again. That's when something odd showed up. A brief but consistent bounce in signal about 28 minutes long where the bus appeared to divert off Route 60 and dip south toward a service road not connected to any mapped highway. That service road ran parallel to the Black Hollow drainage basin. It wasn't on the original list of cleared roads for school transport. It wasn't even on the county's public records in 2009. But it existed. Still does. They showed me the aerial imagery new satellite passes that had been requested once the SUV clip went public. And there, barely visible between tree lines and broken fence rows, was a dirt path winding off into a stretch of land that, according to property records, had changed ownership 5 times in the past 20 years. One name on that chain stood out, an LLC registered under the same parent company that owned the SUV. Kalen had nodded to in the footage. It felt like something was starting to close in, not all at once, but in layers. Quiet connections that had been right there, only no one had looked deep enough. That same afternoon, they sent a team out to the path. The entrance had been blocked off with old corrugated panels and a no trespassing sign dated from 2012. They cleared it and made their way down. The road led to what had once been a modest 2-story building painted cinder block, now sun-bleached and weather-bitten. No signage, no mailbox. Inside it looked abandoned. Stacks of rotted papers, one cot, a rusted filing cabinet with no drawers. But taped to the back of a crumbling storage door, they found a photo. It was faded from sun exposure, curled at the edges. 11 girls standing in front of a bus, red and white uniforms. One of them, Ayana, was mid-laugh. It had been printed from a still frame, likely from Romy's camcorder. And in the lower corner, someone had written in pen Dallas, 09. That one line felt like a taunt, like someone wanted to keep that moment, but only for themselves. Agent Hayward told me later that same week they'd started to re-interview old employees of the bus company Northwood had used. Many had moved on, retired, or passed. But one former dispatcher came forward, a man named Lou Fenley, said he'd worked the radio that week and remembered something strange about Kalen's trip. According to him, Kalen didn't check in once after crossing state lines. No stops, no delays, nothing. But Fenley remembered getting a direct call from Kalen's personal cell, not the bus radio, at around 7:10 p.m. All he said was, "We're on Route Delta." That phrase wasn't part of their regular routing system. In fact, Fenley said they never used letters at all. It stuck with him because Kalen had never broken protocol before. But when Fenley mentioned it to the company supervisor, he was told to drop it. Told it was probably a patch issue or code misread. He left the company the next year. Route Delta. I kept saying it in my head on the way home. It sounded made up, like something someone would use if they didn't want to say where they were. That night I dug out the notebook where I'd been keeping everything, printouts, photos, handwritten maps, and I flipped back to something I hadn't thought about in years. A local article from 2010 about a community health fair hosted by a regional adolescent services group. I only kept it because of one name buried in the sponsor list, Dr. Caleb Vestner. He was described in the article as a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery for at-risk youth. He ran 3 programs across Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. I didn't recognize the name at first, but when I looked closer, one of the programs had the same parent company name as the SUV. The investigators picked it up from there. They ran background checks, subpoenaed bank records, traced the ownership of the buildings, the transport vans, the donation flows. Most of it was clean on paper, but the connections, the little overlaps, started showing up. One of the advisory board members from Northwood in 2009 had served on the board of a community oversight committee tied to Vestner's programs. A former coach from the cheer squad had worked as a seasonal contractor for one of the clinics the year before the girls vanished. None of it was enough on its own, but it started to build something, a shape, a system. And just when they thought it might stall again, a break came from somewhere they didn't expect. Raymond Carter, arrested 3 months earlier in Arizona on an unrelated charge, aggravated battery. When his prints came up in connection to a tape box recovered from the Arkansas property, the Bureau flagged him for further questioning. He was quiet at first. Then he wasn't. Under pressure, he gave them names, not just Kalen, not just Vestner, but others. A former patrol officer in Oklahoma who was paid to look the other way. A cheer camp logistics coordinator who had falsified paperwork. Even a staffer at one of the bus depots who changed logbooks manually. Carter laid it out like someone who didn't think he was confessing. More like someone telling a story he'd told himself so many times it lost meaning. They brought me in again for a separate interview, not as a witness, but as someone who knew the girls. Agent Hayward asked me if Leah had ever mentioned anyone unusual around the team. Any strange chaperones, visiting counselors, new substitutes in those last few weeks. I told her no. Leah had said she felt off the morning they left. A weird vibe was how she'd put it. But she never said why. Maybe she didn't know. Or maybe she did, and she didn't want to make it real by saying it out loud. I left the building just after dark. The parking lot was half empty, and the wind had picked up. Somewhere down the hall behind me, people were still talking phones, ringing, chairs scraping. But outside, everything was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from something about to break. I sat in my car with the keys in my lap and stared at the lit windows 3 stories up. There were more names now, more paper trails, more places to search. But no one had said the word rescue, not yet. I started the engine and pulled out slow headlights, catching the edge of a street sign I'd never noticed before. An old one, faded and tilted, marking the road that ran parallel to the highway. It was labeled Delta Spur. And for the first time, I wondered if someone had named it that on purpose. Not as a warning, not as a code, just as a reminder. Route Delta had always existed. We just hadn't looked hard enough to see it. The first rescue didn't come with sirens or camera crews. It came in the form of a coded message relayed through a federal marshal to Agent Hayward, confirmation that a joint task force had intercepted communications between 2 suspects still under surveillance. The details weren't shared with me then, not fully, but I was told that one of the names mentioned matched a known alias connected to Dr. Vestner's old facility network. That triggered a sweep. The target was a building on the outskirts of Lawton, Oklahoma, once used as a vocational rehab center. The property had been sold years ago and rebranded as a treatment facility for displaced youth. Paperwork showed funding from a mix of church donations and state grants. What they found behind the locked interior wing, though, wasn't treatment. It was containment. They brought in a tactical team. No advance notice, no risk of flight. The building was large, quiet, and nearly empty on the surface. The first floor was mostly dust and discarded furniture. But in the back, behind a narrow hallway lined with hollowed-out offices, they found a reinforced door. And when they opened it, there were 8 women. Malnourished. Some curled up in corners. Some frozen in place. No names were given. No questions answered. Just wide eyes and flinches at sudden movement. The team didn't try to rush them. They were brought out carefully one at a time and loaded into unmarked vehicles headed for a secure medical facility about 90 minutes north. I didn't know anything about it until I got the call from Hayward the next day. She didn't say much, just that the situation was sensitive. and there had been identifications made. I went quiet. I remember staring out the window at a pair of birds pecking at my neighbor's empty feeder while she spoke. When she finally said the words, "We believe one of them is your daughter," I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I just listened. I think some part of me had rehearsed that moment too many times to react. I said yes, I'd come. Yes, I understood the process. Yes, I'd follow whatever guidelines they needed me to. They arranged for a car. I packed nothing but my driver's license and a sweater I hadn't worn in years. The cuffs were still stretched from where Leah used to pull at them on cold mornings waiting for the bus. The drive to the facility was quiet. No music, no conversation. Just the sound of tires humming against pavement and the occasional chirp of a turn signal. We passed through 2 gates and 1 security checkpoint. When we pulled up to the entrance, there were no signs. Just a plain concrete exterior and an automatic door that buzzed once before opening. Inside, the air smelled like bleach and old paper. A nurse met me in the hallway and walked me past a row of closed doors, each identical, each numbered. We stopped at one near the end. She knocked gently, waited, then opened it. The room was spare. A bed, a plastic chair, a window with reinforced glass. And in the corner, facing away, a girl with her knees pulled up to her chest. I didn't recognize her at first. Her hair was cut short, uneven. Her frame was thinner than I remembered. She didn't turn when the door opened. But when the nurse said her name, Leah, she looked up. Her eyes locked on mine. There was a long, motionless beat where neither of us breathed. Then her mouth opened just slightly. "Mom," she said. And that was it. I walked to her slowly, not wanting to startle her. When I knelt beside her, she didn't cry. She just stared like she was trying to make sure I was real. Her hands were shaking. I took one in mine and felt how cold it was. We sat like that for a long time. No questions. No answers. Just presence. I didn't ask what had happened. Not then. Not for days. The doctor said her memories were fractured, that some of them might never return fully. Trauma creates blank spaces, they explained, things the mind erases just to survive. Leah spoke in fragments. Dusty roads, a man with a scar on his cheek, rooms with no windows, pills that made her sleep, voices behind closed doors that used words she didn't understand. She remembered someone telling her they were going home soon, that if they behaved, everything would go back to normal. She said Ayanna had tried to resist once, but they separated them after that. She never saw her again. Of the 8 girls found, 6 were from Northwood. The other 2 were still unidentified teenagers at the time of their abduction, now in their 20s with no clear paper trail. They were quiet, skittish, protective of the others. One of them kept a journal hidden in a sock, small pages filled with dates and tallies and half-written names. The FBI began cross-referencing those names with old missing persons databases, and slowly other families began getting calls. Some got reunions. Some didn't. The next wave of arrests happened fast. Carter's confession had named over a dozen individuals tied to the network. Some were mid-level employees. Some had positions that gave them access to transport logs, school partnerships, or property transfers. Kalen Rohr was arrested outside a gas station 2 towns over. He didn't resist, didn't say a word. The officer who picked him up later told a reporter that Kalen just stared ahead the whole ride, blinking slow like none of it surprised him. They found burner phones in his truck, fake IDs, fake. A journal. The last page had a list of locations and 3 names scratched out. Leah's was one of them. And then there was Vesner, caught trying to board a flight out of San Diego with a briefcase full of cash and 2 passports. He didn't try to run. He smiled during the booking photo. When asked why he did it, he reportedly told one of the agents, "You people don't understand what we were building. He was charged with federal counts of kidnapping, trafficking, conspiracy, and endangerment. More were added later. I didn't go to any of the hearings. I didn't want to see him. I'd already spent too many years looking into faces that had looked away. Back in Maple Hollow, the news broke quickly. People stood in silence outside the gym where the memorial had been held every year. Someone left red and white flowers on each of the 11 chairs the school had kept tucked in storage. The town didn't know what to say. Some families wept. Others couldn't. We buried 3 of the girls who didn't come home. DNA had confirmed remains found during separate sweeps of related properties. I attended all 3 funerals, stood beside parents who had once stood beside me in bleachers and candlelight vigils. We didn't speak much. We didn't have to. Leah stayed in the recovery center for weeks before they cleared her to come home. We didn't go back to the house on Jasper Lane. Too many memories. Too much weight. We moved into a small apartment just outside Columbia. Quiet street. Corner unit. She chose the color of her blanket and what kind of cereal we kept in the pantry. Small choices that gave her control. She didn't like closed doors. She slept with a light on. But some nights she sat on the porch with me in silence, wrapped in an old quilt, listening to the wind move through trees. I never asked what she was thinking. I didn't need to. There's still more to come. More questions. More names surfacing. But that night, sitting beside her while a soft breeze rolled across the pavement, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in 15 years. Not peace, not closure. Just the faint beginning of a life that might one day feel real again. The worst was not behind us. But Leah was no longer missing. And that was enough for now. In the weeks that followed Leah's return, everything around us moved in a strange kind of half-speed. Headlines broke arrests, mounted more survivors were found in other states. Louisiana, Arizona, even as far north as Indiana, but I barely registered any of it at first. I kept my focus small. A morning routine, a list of groceries, a clean set of clothes folded on the edge of her bed. The way Leah gripped her spoon just a little too tightly when she ate, like it might vanish if she let go. But outside our apartment, something much larger was beginning to take shape. And the center of it, the thread, tying everything together, was a name I hadn't heard in over a decade. Caleb Vestner. What they uncovered from his records filled hundreds of pages. The nonprofit front was just a mask, a way to create legitimacy on paper. But behind it were 3 primary facilities, one in Tulsa, one near Texarkana, and a third that had been quietly shut down in 2014 following a so-called internal audit. That third one was the one Leah's group had been cycled through. The property in Arkansas wasn't registered under his name, of course. It was leased through a string of companies that no longer existed. But the layout, the transport logs, even the staff rotation, all of it traced back to his system. There were journals, payroll ledgers, stacks of forms labeled Behavioral Adjustment Intake. Every one of them listed the girls not as students or even patients, but as arrivals. He hadn't done it alone. The scale of it proved that much. Over the next few weeks, 23 individuals were arrested, some in plain sight, others tracked down through financial trails and cell tower pings. 2 were former administrators from Northwood High. Another had been a logistics contractor from the bus company. 3 more had worked as event staff at the cheer camp that had hosted the original competition. Each played a role, some small, some deliberate. Some denied knowing anything. Others confessed outright. There were wire transfers, burner phones, falsified travel documents. All of it pointed to one conclusion: this wasn't an isolated event. It was a pipeline. And Leah's team hadn't been the first to disappear inside it. I remember sitting with Agent Hayward one morning in her temporary field office watching her thumb through an evidence folder. She told me quietly that they'd found something else, a set of VHS tapes recovered from the Arkansas site labeled by year. Some showed empty rooms, Some showed drills or rehearsals staged as therapy sessions, but others were harder to describe. They weren't shown to me. I didn't ask to see them. I just listened as Hayward said they'd be used as evidence and that in some ways they answered the question of why the girls hadn't run. What had been done to them made running almost impossible. You don't run when you've been told that no one is looking for you, that no one is left, that the people who brought you there are the same ones who promised to take you home. In her deposition, one of the other survivors, a girl named Callie, who'd been abducted from a neighboring county the same year as Leah, described the transport van she'd been taken in. It had county markings on the door stickers, she said, just like the local youth center vans. She thought it was real. Her intake form said she'd been voluntarily enrolled in a stabilization program by her legal guardian, except her guardian had died 2 years before. The name listed on the form was forged, but the signature belonged to someone they later identified as a staffer in the now shuttered Texarkana office. One of the men arrested in connection to the case. Some of the people who'd helped build the system were never named. Some fled. Some disappeared before warrants could be issued. One was found in his home 3 days after the first televised press conference, dead from what the coroner ruled a self-inflicted wound. But what remained, the boxes, the records, the survivors, was enough to prove intent, enough to move forward. And, for the first time since the story broke, national outlets began using the word ring. Not scandal, not case, not mystery. A ring, an operation. Built and maintained over years with checks and balances designed to fail on purpose. Vestner was held without bail. His arraignment was closed to the public, but I saw the photo someone took as he was being led into the courtroom. He looked calm, tired maybe. Tired, but not rattled. Not the way you'd expect a man to look when everything he built was falling apart. When the prosecutor read the charges over a dozen federal counts, he didn't flinch. I don't know what that means. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But there was something in his posture that stayed with me long after the photo left the news cycle. Like he still believed he'd been doing something that mattered. Like none of us would ever fully understand what that place had meant to him. The trial was still months away. Depositions were ongoing. Witnesses were being flown in and out of undisclosed locations for protection. But inside our apartment, things were changing in smaller ways. Leah started speaking more. Not a lot, but enough. She asked about Ayanna once, then again. And when I told her we hadn't found her yet, she went quiet for a long time. The next day, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote her name on a piece of printer paper. Just the first name. Then folded it and placed it inside a shoebox with a few other scraps she'd collected. I didn't ask what they were. I just watched her set the box on her nightstand before climbing into bed. We still didn't talk much about the years in between, about what had happened or how she'd managed to hold on. She said there was a woman, maybe a nurse, maybe a teacher, who used to leave extra food in the vent behind the bed. Someone who didn't speak, who never made eye contact, but who, for reasons unknown, had kept her alive. That was all she remembered. That and a song someone used to hum in the hallways late at night. She couldn't place it. But when she closed her eyes and tried to fall asleep, I'd hear her hum sometimes. Just a few bars. A rhythm more than a tune. Then silence again. The system had failed, all of them. That much was clear. The schools, the transportation companies, the vetting processes, the so-called oversight committees. None of it had been built to protect them. It had been built to look like protection, to give people like me the illusion of safety while our daughters vanished through the cracks. But now the cracks were visible. The names were out. And with every new article, every redacted memo released to the press, more people began to ask questions. Parents with their own stories. Journalists chasing tips from years ago. Even a retired postal worker who said she once saw the same SUV parked outside a rest stop just off Route 72. She'd thought it was odd, but hadn't said anything. That silence multiplied by hundreds had allowed the system to grow. Still, it wasn't over. Not yet. There were still 3 girls unaccounted for, their names carved into the walls of that bunker, their photos on the original missing persons bulletin, families still waiting. And somewhere out there, pieces of the network likely remained quiet, hidden, waiting for the noise to die down. But the noise wasn't dying, it was growing. And the silence that had once protected them was breaking one voice at a time. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew what we'd uncovered was no longer buried. The truth was out, and whatever came after, we'd meet it in daylight. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from broken heating or a drafty window, but something built into the walls, into the way people sat with their hands folded and their expressions locked into place. It was standing room only by the time I arrived, though I'd been told I didn't need to come. No one expected me to. I wasn't testifying. I wasn't part of the prosecution team. But I stood near the back anyway, just far enough from the aisle that I could see him when they brought him in. Vestner. He wore a plain suit, dark gray, buttoned too high. His hair had grown out some grayer now. He looked tired, but not shaken. His hands stayed folded in front of him the entire time, resting lightly on the defense table. When the charges were read aloud, count after count, trafficking, conspiracy, child endangerment, falsified records, he didn't react. And for a moment I thought maybe he still believed this was all a misunderstanding, that the system he built was just some overreached bureaucratic blunder that got too much sunlight. But then I looked at the way he shifted in his seat, just slightly like someone who wasn't preparing for trial, but for performance. Outside, the press had taken over both sidewalks. Reporters with microphones stood beside grieving families, some of them still waiting for updates, others now holding photos with updated captions that read "Survivor" beneath the names. I didn't speak to them. I didn't speak to anyone, really. I sat in the hallway until court adjourned for lunch, and then I left. I wasn't there to watch him. I'd already seen enough of what he'd done. What I wanted, what I still wanted, was to understand how it had taken so long to stop. In the weeks that followed, the prosecutions expanded. New charges were filed. 3 more arrests were made, including a former board member from the Oklahoma State Behavioral Council and a man who once managed logistics for a regional bus company that serviced 4 public school districts, including ours. Their names had never come up in the original investigation. Not once. But their bank records told a different story. Consistent payments from shell nonprofits overlapping travel dates, signed contracts with youth transport services that had since been dissolved. Everything that once looked like protocol now revealed itself as a network. A network hidden in plain sight. Families from across the region began coming forward. Some hadn't spoken in years. Some had stopped looking after the first round of dead ends. But the story, the part that had started with a grainy VHS tape and a paused frame in a school parking lot, had given them something new. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was proof. One mother from Arkansas brought in a worn composition notebook filled with letters her daughter had written before she vanished in 2011. The last page read, "If I disappear, find the driver who didn't smile." A father from Kansas submitted voicemail recordings he'd saved on an old flip phone, brief, muffled background noise, followed by a girl's voice saying, "Tell Mom I wasn't sick. I never was." The details were always different, but the patterns were the same. Promises of reform, bus rides that led to silence, and then nothing, until now. The state formed a special task force just to manage the volume. Case files once marked inactive were pulled, reclassified, and digitized. Dozens of volunteers, some retired law enforcement, some survivors themselves, joined the effort. There was a sense for the first time that the narrative didn't belong to just one town or one group of families. It belonged to all of us. Everyone who'd ever been told they were imagining things, that they were too late, that no one could help them now. And through it all, I kept my head down. I took calls when asked. I answered questions carefully. But most of my energy stayed focused on Leah. She had good days and bad ones. On the good days, she'd sit beside me on the porch and trace the pattern of light through the trees with her eyes, not saying anything, but staying present. On the bad ones, she didn't come out of her room. There were still nights where I'd hear her pacing. Once I found her sitting in the hallway outside the bathroom at 2 a.m, knees tucked up under her chin, eyes wide but unfocused. She wouldn't say what triggered it. She didn't need to. It was the kind of fear that lived under the skin. She still asked about Ayanna, about Romy, about the ones who hadn't come home. She was starting to understand the difference between what she remembered and what had been told to her. Her mind had protected her for so long, but the fog was lifting, and with it came questions, some I could answer, some I couldn't. She wanted to know who else had known, who had helped, why no one had stopped it sooner. I told her the truth, that some people didn't look. Some people did and chose not to see. And some were paid not to care. She didn't cry. But she didn't speak again for the rest of the night. 3 of the 11 girls were never found. Their names remained carved into the concrete of that basement. Their faces printed on every flyer, every vigil candle, every archived news article. The FBI confirmed that they had reason to believe at least one had been transferred out of state shortly after the Arkansas property was vacated in 2010. There were rumors of another site, possibly in Nevada, but by the time agents got there, the building had been cleared out, stripped down, repainted. No evidence, no records, just a name in faded lettering above the door, New Dawn program. It hadn't existed on paper in years. But not every ending went missing. One of the girls found in Louisiana had kept a small metal charm tied around her ankle with a shoelace. It was bent rusted, and at first they thought it was just debris, but etched into the surface were 3 letters LDR. Leah Danielle Rourke, my daughter's initials. The girl said she'd found it hidden in a floorboard crack during her first month there, that someone must have left it behind. She didn't know what the letters meant, only that she'd kept it because it felt important. When they brought it to me, I recognized it immediately. It was a pendant Leah had made in middle school back when she thought she wanted to be a metalsmith. She'd lost it during her freshman year. We thought it was gone for good, but somehow it had made its way into another life. A message passed without knowing, a thread that connected them all, even across states, across years. By spring, the legal process had reached a rhythm. Grand juries, federal trials, pre-sentencing interviews. Kalen Rohr accepted a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation. His testimony helped secure a conviction against one of the transport coordinators in Texas, but his own sentencing would come later. I didn't attend those hearings. I didn't need to hear him speak. His silence for 15 years had already told me everything I needed to know. Back in Maple Hollow, they decided to move the memorial. Not to erase it, but to give it a new place. A local artist offered to design a sculpture using materials donated by the families. Bits of fabric, pieces of old uniforms, even a broken camcorder lens recovered during one of the raids. The school board approved the plan. When they asked me if Leah wanted to contribute something, she thought about it for a long time. Then she walked into her room, opened her shoebox, and handed me the paper with Ayanna's name. The sculpture went up in front of the town library. Not flashy, just a low, curved arc of brushed metal with 11 small stones embedded at its base, one for each of them. Leah and I visited it once before the dedication ceremony early in the morning when no one else was around. She didn't say anything, just ran her fingers across the cold surface and nodded once. That was all. And then we went home. The story wasn't over. There were still more names to uncover, more leads to chase. But for the first time in 15 years, we were no longer asking whether it had happened, only how and how far it had gone. The answers weren't easy, but they were coming, and with each new truth a part of the silence lifted. The silence that once covered an entire town, an entire system, now had a crack running through it. Wide enough to let light in, wide enough for the truth to get through. I still drive past the library some mornings just to see if the light hits the sculpture differently. It never really does, but I stop anyway. There's something in the quiet curve of that metal, the way it catches the air without making a sound. Some days I think about the weight that must live inside the people who helped build that system, the ones who looked away, who signed the papers, who called it care. And other days I think about the girls, about Ayana Romy, the ones whose names are still whispered between families never printed on recovery lists. And Leah, who made it home but not unchanged. She's older now than I ever imagined she'd be, not just in years, but in how she carries herself. She moves through the world with a kind of deliberate quiet, not fragile but watchful. We take things slow. Some mornings we walk the perimeter of the park where she used to ride her bike. She's not trying to reclaim it, not exactly. It's more like she's choosing what parts she wants to remember. She doesn't always speak, and I've learned not to fill the silence. Some things don't need answers, just space. I get letters now, from other parents, from people who saw the story and recognized pieces of it in their own lives. Some just say thank you. Others ask how I kept going. I never have a clean answer. You don't keep going because you're strong. You do it because you don't know how to stop, and because someone has to remember. There's one line from a counselor that I still carry with me. She said healing doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it just feels like sitting still without flinching. That's what this has become. Not justice in the way people imagine it, no headlines or grand reversals, just a slow returning of names of places of truths that were nearly lost to silence. Vesner won't get out, neither will the others, the ones who made careers out of erasure. Their convictions don't bring anyone back, but they do draw a line in the dirt, a line that says someone saw this, someone said no more. I keep Leah's charm in a drawer now, the one with her initials LDR. The girl in Louisiana gave it back to me, but I couldn't throw it away. It's bent worn nearly smooth, but it stayed whole, somehow, through everything. If you've listened this far, thank you. Not just for hearing the story, but for holding it. That's how we keep these lives from disappearing again. If this stayed with you, if you remember one name, one place, one voice, consider sharing it. So no one forgets how easily the truth can go quiet, and how long it takes to bring it back.